All right, so it's great to see you all. Wonderful Tuesday again. And next week we'll see, because next week is Thanksgiving week. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to be traveling during the week. Most years I do. Not sure about this year, but we'll see. Maybe you'll be traveling. Find out it's the highest traveled time of the year. So let's remind ourselves what we've been talking about. We're in chapter 24, which is a kind of a culmination, along with chapter 25, of what the Alter Rebbe deems the shorter path, meaning the quicker path to inspiration. Obviously, the long path to inspiration is simple to describe. All you got to do is study about God very deeply and study at length until you get so inspired, and then you follow everything God wants. Okay, that's great, but it requires a lot of study, a lot of hard work. And so, oddly enough, this is what we call the easier route. Oh, I forgot to spotlight myself. You should always remind me to do that too. Okay, so I'm spotlighted. So that is always the easier route. Sorry, so the easier route that the Alter Rebbe offers is one in which doesn't actually seem so easy, but it just means it's an easier meditation. Nothing is really easy, but it's kind of within everybody's reach, is what he means. Um, it's like if you say if you want to make money, you just have to go to work, right? I mean, assuming that's the way it works, right? Okay, so you just do the work and you'll get the money. So in this case, the Alter Rebbe is saying, I have a meditation for you and a thought for you that is easy enough for everybody to grasp. And the thought goes like this, as you've been sharing and developing over the last couple of weeks. And every week, as I always say, there's a general theme. There's each week there's something specific we gain, and we find that every week. But I just want to remind you generally where the Tanya is heading. And the general where the Tanya is heading over here is to let you know that because each and every single one of us has a godly soul inside of us that naturally loves God and does not want to disconnect from God, therefore, you should naturally want to avoid any sin, because any sin will disconnect you from God. And we spoke about that last week at length. And we spoke about how every mitzvah connects you with God. And we wanted to describe that even the greatest sinner, even an adulterous woman, would give up her life for God. What that tells you is that deep down, this person does love God. So why does this person sin? Right, the question is, if a person is willing to give up their life for God, why would they sin on a very minor sin, right? And the answer is, of course, because we create differentiations in our mind. We differentiate, oh, idolatry disconnects me from God, but if I sleep in and I don't say the morning Shema, that does not disconnect me from God. Um, Idolatry separates me from God, but if I, if I eat a cheeseburger, I mean, what's the big deal? Does God really care about the cheeseburger? God cares about the big things, right? As we spoke about last week as well, that somebody's truly infinite, big and small is the same to them. That's what makes God truly great. Real greatness is when big and small is the same. That's why when we talk about, for example, the Rebbe, one of the people talk about his greatness is how he would talk to children as well, right? That's the sign of true greatness. True greatness is someone who, but when we're talking about God, an infinite God, there's really no difference. It doesn't take up more of his time to worry about the small little things that we do. So his basic point is, if you were to contemplate and realize that every single sin that you do disconnects you from God, and every single mitzvah connects you to God, and you know that deep down you truly love God, you would never sin. That's his basic point. However, he's still in the middle of developing it. And so as where we're up to, we were up to page 277. And 277, we were in this discussion of this adulteress. And we said this adulteress would give up her life for idolatry. No, she would not survive a worship. She would rather die, but she will sin, and that's because she creates a differentiation in her mind. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to say that, truthfully, when you sin, there is no differentiation. Adam, are you sure we're up to 279 last week? Because I looked at the recording. Me looked at 277. No? Okay. Anyway, so let's take a look here. Let's share over here. Share screen. Yes, Adam?
No, I had it around 278, 79.
Ah, okay. But you're not, but it could be 277.
Could be.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Just making sure he didn't draw on with a pencil. Okay. So he's gonna say over here. Now he's gonna read that the truth is, as we said earlier, that the idea that adultery is more tolerable is an unfound rationalization. So we discussed it last week. Now we're going to read it inside, and it'll hammer it home. And it's important to hammer this idea home because this is the crux of the Tanya's argument, that there is no difference. The whole meditation that the Alter Rebbe is offering here only works if you get this idea that there is really no difference between sins. There is no bigger sin and small sin. Every sin contains one basic element to it, and that is disconnection from God. Why is it disconnection from God? It's placing your wants, your needs, your desires ahead of God's. So let's continue. So it says like this, but in actual reality, the idea that adultery is more tolerable transgression is an unfounded rationalization, because even with a minor transgression, the person violates the divine will and is thereby detached completely from God's non-dual reality and oneness. Oh, it reminded me, I had a great example for this. I saw today. There are sometimes where parents or teachers or educators will crack down on a child, and I don't mean it. I'm not saying to be a mean parent, but I'm just saying the idea that sometimes parents will come down very hard on their children, even though the infraction is minor, because because it's not about the infraction, it's about the lack of respect and care, right? So imagine a parent asks their child to clean up their plate. So the child doesn't clean up their plate. It's not really a big deal in a larger scheme of things. It's not like the kid is hitting or biting or painting the walls, or I can give you other examples of things my kids do, right? So why is it so important? Because you need to have, the child needs to understand that they should follow directions in the home as long as they're children in the home. And we could have parenting discussions another time, but that's the general idea. There has to be a certain level of decorum and respect maintained. And when the child chooses not to listen, it doesn't make a difference that it's a smaller infraction. The act of not listening is the same, whether it's hitting or whether it's the plate or whether it's the wall. Yes, the action itself, one action is more damaging than the other, but the act of not listening is the same. That's the Alter Rebbe's argument. He says the same thing is about sins. Every sin is an act of rebelling against God. The after effects of a mitzvah can be different, just as not putting away your plate or painting the walls is different, but the essence of disconnection is the same. Hope that clarifies. Let's continue. The Alter Rebbe is going to give that exact point later on. I'm just giving you a head so you doesn't percolate in your mind, because it's a foreign concept to people that there really is no difference in sins, that every sin is really inherently the same to a certain extent. So he says, like, he continues over here inside. He said that even with a minor transgression, the person violates the divine will and is thereby detached completely from God's non-dual reality and oneness. In fact, as we learned above in section 2, the transgression is even more detached from God than the sitrach and the klipa itself. So again, we explained that when you sin, you are actually worse than the negative forces of this world, because the negative forces of this world are still working for God. He says, like, this force is so distant from God that they are referred to as other gods in literal idolatry. The transgressor is lower than all the things in this world which are powered by klipa. So he's saying here, not only are you going to be lower than the klipot, but you'll actually be lower than animals. So lions, tigers, and bears, you'll be lower than them. You'll be worse than them. How so? So he'll explain. So he says like this, namely non-kosher cattle, wild animals, and non-kosher birds and insects and reptiles. As the saying goes, the mosquito preceded you. The Talmud teaches that in the biblical account of creation, man was formed last to endow with a sense of humility. As soon as man becomes arrogant, he can be reminded the mosquito preceded you. So, this is going to be an interesting point. The Alter Rebbe is going to say that when we sin, we are even worse than mosquitoes. We're worse than lions. We're worse than bears. We're worse than vultures. Whatever animal you want to think of, which is kind of a strange thing to say because you might say, how can I be worse than an animal? Like, I mean, do animals sin? I mean, do animals do anything wrong? So he's going to make a point here later that animals actually do have one mitzvah and they do follow that mitzvah, as we'll see soon. So animals are generally endowed by the Creator to be animals, but they do have one commandment, and that one commandment they actually follow. And so therefore, when you sin, you're actually worse than animals. But he's also going to go on metaphorically. The Talmudic sages tell us, and we'll read it inside in a moment, the Talmudic sages tell us, as we know, that man is created last. And they say it's a double message. Mankind is created last. It's a double message. On the one hand, you can look at it as, man was created when everything was ready. Right? When everything was ready, when all was ready for mankind, then God brought mankind into the world. Or you can look at it as, no, you're created last. You're the least important. And so the Talmudic sages, we have a choice. When we do a mitzvah, when we show our superiority over the world, so to speak, superiority in a good way, not like, we're better. I mean, we are better. We are created with the capability to be better than let's say all mankind. We're the top of the food chain, so to speak, spiritually. When we do a mitzvah, when we do what we're meant, when we do what God asks of us, then we say, yes, we were created last because the world was supposed to be ready for us to perfect it. But when we sin, we're worse than the worst animal. And the Talmud says, what's the worst animal? Is a mosquito. Now, I'm not exactly sure if the Hebrew word yitosh means mosquito, but it refers to a bug that only swallows and never defecates. Do mosquitoes, do they have waste product? I'm not sure. But it's referring to an animal that takes and never gives. And spiritually, so that's what the Talmud says. And spiritually, the Talmud is going to explain that actually means that the mosquito is the worst type of creature that the world can have. Why? The worst type of thing you can have in the world is something that takes and never gives. That's why the example, it says, when you sin, you're worse than the mosquito. I'm going to use the word mosquito. I don't know if it's actually a mosquito, but it's going to say you're worse than a mosquito, which, by the way, we're in Florida, so mosquito's pretty bad. You're worse than a mosquito. What does a mosquito signify? The mosquito signifies something that only takes and never gives. That's a terrible thing. But nevertheless, it's going to say that we are worse than the mosquito when we sin. So let's take a look in the text. By the way, this is an important life lesson. It's kind of related to our class that we're doing on Wednesday night. But I always say there's always little messages in the Tanya. This idea of a mosquito being the worst type of animal is instructive to us. We have to look in our lives. Are we being like mosquitoes? Are we only looking what we can get, or are we also giving? Are we looking only what we can gain out of life, or are we looking what we can bring to the world? And if we're just consumers, we talk about in America where it's a very consumer-centric society. If we're just consumers, it's a very big problem. So let's continue. So based on the insight of this chapter, Tanya offers a deeper insight into the Talmud's word that when you sin, you're worse than a mosquito. Meaning that even the mosquito, which is the most selfish creature of the animal kingdom, that it has an orifice for ingesting but not excreting, indicating that it is powered by the very lowest and most selfish klipa. Remember, selfishness is the worst. As I always say, ego stands for edging God out. And it is therefore distant from the powers of holiness, the hallmark of holiness being the opposite of selfish, the willingness to give, even to those who are very far. Nevertheless, even this utterly selfish mosquito spiritually precedes and surpasses a person who transgresses. So why am I worse than an animal? So he continues, for as we have seen, a person who chooses to transgress and violate God's will is far worse than all the klipos which do not disobey God. The mosquito precedes the transgressor in terms of how far down from the divine will it receives its life energy. In other words, what makes something better or worse is how distant it is from God. That's our definition. If you were to ask me what's bad in this world, what's evil, bad, evil is the more you're separated from God, the more evil it is. What's better, it's holier, things that are more connected to God. That's the question you need to ask yourself every single time you want to do something. Will this action connect me to God more, or will it distance me from God? So it's just an interesting point that comes out of here, but that's his point here, saying that the mosquito is considered very distant from the divine will because God had to create such a despicable creature. When I say despicable, I mean with bad character traits, okay? To the point that it swallows and it doesn't give out. I want to take a moment to say something, just an interesting point on this idea. The idea of animals with bad character traits. The Rabbi made a campaign in his earlier years that children should be surrounded only by kosher animals, because we're told the reason why we don't eat non-kosher animals is because they embody negative character traits. They're generally animals that will tear apart other animals: bears, lions, tigers. You know, non-kosher animals typically are the more vicious type of animals, and the kosher animals are more calm, collected animals. So the idea is that these animals have a negative character trait, so we don't want to become like them. So the Rebbe made a campaign actually that children, if they have dolls or they have clothing, they should not be surrounded by images of non-kosher animals. Now kids can learn about non-kosher animals. You can take them to the zoo. You can have a book about animals. But if you're going to make a book about, lots of kids' books have like characters in them, right? So only put kosher animals as the characters: a sheep, a cow. It's very popular for kids to have teddy bears, but in Chabad we don't do that. You won't find, my kids don't have any clothing that have any animal pictures on it. They don't have any plush dolls or whatever that are non-kosher animals. We try to surround our children with positive images and positive things. If there's a kid's book like this, inside the book, if they have a doll, it'll be a doll of a kosher animal. And there are like videos made here, for example, just see here, right? You see there's a giraffe. Giraffes are actually kosher. Right? So you won't find any teddy bears in this book. It was actually, there was the Rebbe used to make Chabad used to make this big parade for Lag BaOmer, a time of Jewish pride and unity. And one year the organizers wanted to excite the kids, so they had a bunch of Disney characters, proudly presenting different mitzvahs that people should do. And the Rebbe then spoke about afterwards, like, we don't want to have a mouse, we don't want to have we don't want to have we don't want mouse. We don't want the dog. Good question. Someone says that's why people don't have dogs or cats in Chabad. It's a good question. I'm not sure it applies. It's a good question if that's related. Seemingly you would think yes, that's why you wouldn't have. But I mean, the Rebbe himself owned a dog, was a guard dog, but it lived next door. Didn't live in his house. So I'm not sure necessarily it applies to live animals that you're caring for. I mean, it was common in the old country for people to have farms. Did they have non-kosher animals? The Torah does say you shouldn't, guard dog is functional, correct? The Torah says you shouldn't raise pigs in Israel. I know it says that. It's a good question. Would require further looking into it. I'm not sure. The Rebbe was specifically talking about surrounding kids. There's actually also a custom, by the way, that pregnant women in Chabad don't go to the zoo to see non-kosher animals either. It's that when a woman is pregnant, everything she sees has an effect on the child. Just telling other things. So this all is connected. I kind of got off tangent, but it's just an interesting point. So now you know if you buy a present for a Chabadnik, make sure you get them only with kosher animals. That's why also, like it's very popular. They have these teddy bears holding dreidels, these blow ups. You won't see Chabadniks putting those out again because when we have the option, we want to always surround ourselves with kosher animals. If obviously you have to learn about non-kosher animals, and in our preschool classrooms there are some non-kosher animals you got to teach them. I mean, if you're teaching about Noah and the flood, I mean, there's kosher and non-kosher animals. But when there's no reason to take the non-kosher animal, take the kosher animal. So when you're putting something on the shirt, or anyways, this just goes a worldview of a spiritual worldview of really everything that we see and everything that we hear can have an effect on us. And the reason there are kosher animals and non-kosher animals is because of certain characteristics. And therefore, if we have the option to surround ourselves with teddy bears or with little sheep, we'll take little sheep. Okay, that's enough for my tangent. Now we're going to get back here that animals, the mosquito is the worst. I'm sure you'll all agree, at least at that point, that the mosquito is the worst. And again, what makes something bad is something that what makes something bad is the fact that they receive their life energy from God at a further distance. And he says like this. He says, if the transgressor is lower than the mosquito, then all the more so he is lower than other non-kosher animals of the animal kingdom. Even the ferocious animals, which spiritually speaking are greater than the mosquitoes, since they exhibit kindness as well as selfishness. Interestingly, so other animals, a lion might exhibit some kindness, though it does exhibit a lot of selfishness. And he says like this, since none of these animals deviate from their divinely allotted role, and his providence watches over their spirit. So animals follow what God asks of them to do. They are meant to be animals and they're following. But now he's going to actually bring an interesting example. He's going to say not only that, but animals have one very specific commandment, and they actually follow it. Let's rotate left. Right. So again, this is all to his point that animals follow what they're meant to do. Sorry, I'm trying to get this. My videos are gone stir crazy. Okay. He says like this. He says, and even though they don't see it, meaning the animals themselves, like, what do you mean? Animals know that they're following God's will. So even though they don't see it, even though the animals may not be conscious that God's divine providence guides their every move, nevertheless, their spirit is aware, as the verse states. So here is the mitzvah that the Torah says that animals have, and the fear and dread of you will fall on all the wild animals of the earth. So this is in Genesis. God tells Adam and Eve that all the animals will fear you. As our sages of blessed memory explained, no wild animal has any power over a person unless he has sinned and therefore appears like an animal. So this is an interesting point. So what he's saying here is that animals have a commandment not to hurt people. And in fact, naturally, they should fear mankind. That's their commandment. So you might ask, so why do we find animals that do hurt human beings? And obviously the Alter Rebbe's answer is that, what does it say? You have to look like a human being as God deems it. You have to have the why do animals fear man? Because they have God's they're created in the image of God. When we do sins and we remove from ourselves the image of God, then the animals can attack us. But this explains why there are literally hundreds of stories where our literature and our stories are littered with hundreds of stories of great righteous people where wild animals did not hurt them. You have the most famous story in the Tanakh. You have the story of Daniel, who was thrown into a pit with all the lions, and they didn't hurt him. Miracle, yes, but they won't hurt. And there are hundreds and hundreds of stories of wild animals that did not attack righteous people. There's a famous story of the Orach Chaim, of the great rabbi of, I believe he was from Baghdad. I'm not sure. He's about 400 years ago, Sephardic rabbi and he was once going with a caravan, and they promised him before they left to walk through the desert that they would stop on Shabbat. And when Shabbat came, they said, sorry, we tricked you. Either you walk with us or you left alone in the desert. And being left alone in the desert is very dangerous. Well, he said, I'm not moving at Shabbos. And as he sat down to celebrate a Shabbos all by himself, some lions came over to him and they sat next to him all Shabbos. And when Shabbos was over, he rode on the lion back to his caravan. And of course, they were all afraid. But there's many, many such stories. The Baal Shem Tov has many stories where he would go visit rabid Jew haters, and they all had these guard dogs outside, and they would all stand still. So there's literally, again, if there's one recurring theme that I could say that appears in stories of our righteous sages throughout the generations, it is this, that the animals always are afraid. The animals always are afraid or show respect to the righteous individuals. And it's not just simply a miracle, though of course a miracle is nice. It's much more than just a miracle. It's actually the natural order of things. Naturally, animals are supposed to be afraid of human beings. That's how God created it. The only reason that animals ever attack people, as he says here, is because we have removed from ourselves the image of God. And the reason he went into this whole tangent was to tell you that you should know animals will always do what God asks of them. What does God ask of them? Not to attack human beings. You might say they do attack human beings. They only attack human beings who have lowered themselves lower than animals. But human beings who are still human beings with the image of God upon them, an animal will never attack them. So let's take a look back in the text. So he says like this. He says, and with tzaddikim, righteous people, whose face the divine image never departs, all while the animals are subdued in their presence, as stated in the Zohar concerning Daniel in the lion's den. If so, then a person who sins violating God's will through even a minor transgression is utterly distanced from God's holiness, i.e. is non-dual oneness at the moment of sin, more than all the non-kosher animals, insects, and reptiles, which are powered by Sitra Achar and Klipa. In summary, all transgressions are a violation of God's will, and therefore a rejection of his non-dual oneness. When faced with temptation to commit any transgression, say to yourself, there is essentially no difference between doing this sin and worshiping idols. Both will disconnect me from God unequivocally. With this thought in mind, it is very much within reach to refrain from transgression. So I want to explain one thing. Why did he go in the whole tangent of the animals? It's not as Tanya is not really a book of Musar. Musar is a book that likes to put you down. What I mean is some sections of Jewish ethics really like to describe to you how terrible it is when you sin, because it wants to make you scared of sinning, makes you sound like a terrible person. Then it wants to tell you how good you are when you do good. But we have to remember the Tanya is not that style. And so I don't want anybody to walk away from the Tanya and think, oh, the Alter Rebbe is coming here with some scare tactics, trying to tell you that you're the most despicable being on earth. When you sin, you're worse than mosquitoes. His point here is it was all a tangent to bring out his primary point. Again, the Tanya is written also for a scholar to prove points. He's trying to prove his main point, which is any sin that you do disconnects you from God. And that is expressed by the fact that any sin makes you worse than animals. How so? Because every sin is a disconnection from God going against God's will. Even animals don't go against God's will. So it's all really to point out his main point. And his main point, again, which we shouldn't lose sight of, is that every sin is a disconnection and disobedience of God, and that's what makes us worse than animals. Again, why did I say wild animals? All that means is you're far from God. So that means when you sin, you're worse than the worst animal. That means you're very distant from God at this moment. You're disconnecting yourself as much as possible in that moment, and that's his point. So again, I don't want anybody to walk away from the Tanya and think these are scare tactics, because that's not Chabad style. It's not the Tanya style. It's not his point. His point is just to present to you the main idea, which is to recognize that every sin, doesn't have to be idolatry. Every sin disconnects you from God, and you should not think otherwise. Any questions before we continue to the next section? I think they're all as clear as day, or all as clear as mud. Interesting fact, and today was the last day of sunlight in some cities in Alaska. I guess they have to skip the morning prayers for the next 65 days. Okay. Totally unrelated, just an interesting fact I thought today.
Wow,
Huh?
that's scary. And how does it work? I guess at the time that it was established, people were in Israel,
How does what work?
but Chabad was established in Russia, which is close to the idea.
Chabad is not that far north.
Oh, it's not.
Only the more northern cities. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. They have just established Chabad in a more northern city recently. Fairbanks, Alaska. It's even colder than Anchorage. But again, they still have days of sunlight and sunset. Okay. We are going to continue over here to the next section. Where was I? Okay. Now he's going to explain. Again, the Tanya, as I said, was written for the layperson and the scholar, and he's going to prove his point and answer some side questions about how we can say every commandment is equal. So let's take a look at this section, because you may have lingering questions if it's really true. So let's continue. Proof that all transgressions are equal. And again, he's harping on this point, and he's very emphatic about this point because this is the basis of his thesis over here. And so he has to continuously come back to it because it's not what we would naturally think. We would not naturally think that every sin and every mitzvah has an equal footing on some level. So he says like this. In the following section, this is section 4, the Tanya will challenge the notion that all transgressions are equal violations of God's will from the point of Jewish law. Let's take a look. And I'm sorry, I got to rotate again. I don't know why I did it all like this today, but let's continue. Okay, so like this. As for the Talmudic principle that unlike idolatry, for which a person must allow himself to be killed rather than transgress, with other transgressions, that is not the case, and saving one's life takes precedence. And we are told transgress and do not allow yourself to be killed. So in Jewish law, some mitzvahs require us to sacrifice our lives for them, while others do not. But as we shall see, this does not contradict the Tanya's argument that all transgressions are equal violations of God's will. So let me explain his question and answer, because we might lose it because it's complicated. He's asking a question like this. He's saying, we know that if someone puts a gun to your head and says, bow down to this idol or I'm going to shoot you, you should take that bullet. But if someone takes a gun to your head and says, light this fire on Shabbat, or I'm going to shoot you, you should light the fire. So doesn't that tell me that idolatry does disconnect you from God more? How do I know? Because God himself tells me, you better not serve idol worship. Even if you're going to die, don't serve idol worship. When it comes to Shabbat, God says, no. God says, desecrate the Shabbos. So that means Shabbos doesn't super disconnect you from God as much as idol worship. So he's going to give one answer. His first answer is going to be that if that was the case, then the rabbis would have said as much. The rabbis would have given the reason. The rabbis strive to explain why one should desecrate the Shabbos when it comes to saving your life. And they don't give the answer that, oh, well, the Shabbos doesn't disconnect you from God so much, so that's why you should desecrate it. No, they give actually a very logical answer. They say it's better to desecrate this one time so that you can keep Shabbos another time. In other words, really, you shouldn't desecrate Shabbos. Really, you should give up your life. But for Shabbos, it's better that you desecrate Shabbos once so that you can keep many more Shabbos. Let's take a look here at the text. But he'll give a more satisfying, I don't want to say satisfying to me, I should say after this. It says like this. The requirement to transgress rather than to be killed is understood not as a value judgment of which prohibitions are more important in God's eyes, but according to the sage's explanation. The Torah says, violate one Sabbath for a sick person in order that he will be able to observe many more Sabbaths. The Torah's instruction to transgress and do not allow yourself to be killed in the case of some prohibitions does not prove that these precepts are less important. Rather, as the sages thought, it is simply in the Torah's long-term interest that a person should live so that he will be able to observe more mitzvahs. the requirement to transgress and to not allow yourself to be killed is simply a pragmatic approach aimed at maximizing mitzvah observance by keeping a person alive. It is not motivated by a value system of major or minor transgressions that evaluate idolatry as more severe. Now you can still ask, but if that's true that it's motivated by the ability to let you do more mitzvahs, then say the same thing by idolatry. And say the same thing that by idolatry, also serve the idol worship so I can keep more mitzvahs later on. Why don't I make the same argument by idolatry? So he's going to prove now that actually idolatry and Shabbos are similar in some areas. In other words, in, so to speak, their severity, they are similar in some areas. And the fact that here they are not similar when it comes to giving up your life is not based on any value system, rather it is God's divine decree. I know it's not the answer you're looking for, but basically he's going to make the argument that the reason why we give up our lives for these three mitzvos, for the three cardinal sins, for idolatry, adultery, and murder, is not based on pitting one mitzvah against another, but rather it's God's commandment. And it's not something that we can therefore say, oh, I understand that this mitzvah is better than that. It's God's commandment. Because really, when you think about it, what's the big deal if you bow down to an idol? Okay, so you bow down once and you don't even mean it. Like, honestly, when you think about it, why should that be different than Shabbos? I mean, Shabbos is an amazing mitzvah. Let me. The same way I transgress Shabbos this week, so I can keep many more Shabboses. If someone's putting a gun to my head and says, "You better bow down to this idol, or else I'm going to shoot you," wouldn't it make sense logically that I should bow down to that idol, having in mind that I don't mean it, and then I'll live another 50 years of my life as a religious Jew doing many, many mitzvahs? Wouldn't God gain more from that? And the Alter Rebbe is going to prove again that Shabbos and idolatry have the same level of severity in some areas of Jewish law. And the fact that they're different over here is not because one disconnects you more from God than the other. Rather, it is just a divine decree. God says, there are three things that I want that you should give up your life for. 3 commandments, 3 deeds. Now, I want to say the reason we're not talking about the other two is because the other two are actually very logical. The other two, one is murder. So that's something that everybody can understand logically. In other words, you don't have to go into a whole spiritual value system pitting one mitzvah against another. We all understand that I should not kill someone to save my life. Okay? So that's why that doesn't get into the discussion here in the Tanya. And similarly, the forbidden relations, the Torah, at least in its value system, compares when you have a forbidden relation with someone, it's akin to murder to some extent. Today you can make the argument, psychologists can tell you to some extent, right? When you rape someone or whatever, the negative effects it has on them. But again, regardless of whether you understand that or not, the Torah compares forbidden relations, certain ones, not all of them, certain forbidden relations to murder. And therefore, that's why the Tanya is not discussing those two. We're only discussing idolatry, because the fact that you're supposed to sacrifice yourself not to serve an idol is definitely based on a spiritual value system. It's not something that's necessarily logical. Like I said, logically, I would say, well, bow down. Go bow down for 5 minutes and live the rest of your life, as a religious person. All right, so let's get to his argument. The crux of his argument is going to be like this, and it's actually a complicated one, so maybe I should explain it outside. The crux of his argument is like this. You know what? I'm going to read it first, then I'll explain it. Maybe that way we'll catch it better. So let's read again. So, all right, he says, the requirement to transgress and not to allow yourself to be killed is simply a pragmatic approach aimed at maximizing mitzvah observance by keeping the person alive, and is not motivated by a value system of major and minor transgressions that evaluate idolatry as more severe. Proof for this can be derived from the following contradiction between 2 points of Jewish law. Sabbath violation is equally severe to idolatry in terms of whether Jewish law allows us to trust the ritual slaughterer performed by a person who generally observes Jewish law, but in one particular area he is lax, as stated in Code of Jewish Law, Yoredea, Chapter 2, Law 5. So what is he talking about? He's going to explain. Let's read the next paragraph. A person who conducts ritual slaughter needs to be pious, because if he fails to observe Jewish law properly or does not inform the public of his errors, the community will be fed non-kosher meat. Okay, so again, the person slaughtering the animal has to be someone who observes Jewish law, and therefore will be slaughtering according to Jewish law. But what if a ritual slaughterer is generally Torah observant, but he is lax about one particular prohibition? Jewish law states that we do trust his ritual slaughter so long as the precept in which he's lax in is not idol worship or Sabbath violation. So again, the Torah says, Jewish law says that if you have a ritual slaughterer who generally keeps all the laws, but there's one law he doesn't keep. Let's say he is lax in gossip. He tells gossip a lot. Can I eat his meat? The answer is yes. Okay. Let's say he is lax in based on what I'm reading here, let's say he's lax. Every once a week he eats a cheeseburger. Can I eat his meat? It seems like the answer is yes. But let's say he's lax in Shabbat observance. No. Let's say he's lax in idol worship. No, then I can't eat his meat. And obviously we're talking about in modern times where there's no court that's going to put people to death for serving idols. But what's interesting, not included here, as the Tanya is going to point out, is what if he's lax in forbidden relations? So here you can have a Jew who's generally pious, but on the side he has a mistress. According to Jewish law, you can eat his meat. His ritual slaughter is considered kosher. But that's weird, because if we break it down, isn't violating forbidden relations worse, according to our logic, right? Isn't violating forbidden relations worse than violating the Shabbos? Why? Because you're allowed to violate the Shabbos to save your life. You're not allowed to do forbidden relations to save your life. Yet here we have an individual who, if he does the quote-unquote more severe sin of forbidden relations, I can eat his meat. But if he does the more lax sin of Shabbat, I cannot eat his meat. It's not logical. Therefore, the Alter Rebbe says, none of this means one mitzvah is more strict and one mitzvah is more lax. That doesn't mean one mitzvah is more important and one mitzvah is less important. The reason for these laws, why you give up your life for these laws, or why the ritual slaughter is not good over here, is all just God's divine will. It's called Gezerah Takasif. It's what God wants. It's not reasonable. It's not something you can explain. It's just what God wants. So let's continue reading that, where he's going to talk about forbidden relations. Now, by the way, I'm not telling anybody you should go ahead now and go ahead with some forbidden relations. In fact, I'm not telling you to go ahead with any sin. All right, let's continue over here. Let's. It appears from this ruling that both idol worship and the Sabbath are considered equally severe in Jewish law, which is not the case with a person who is lax with forbidden relations, such as adultery, where unlike idol worship and Sabbath violation, the law states that we can still trust the ritual slaughter if he is lax in just this one precept. So it's kind of a crazy thought to think, right? So you have this guy, he's very religious and commits adultery on the side. I know it sounds funny and would be very interesting to find such a thing, but regardless, such a person, you can eat their meat. So again, his point here is that we cannot say that one mitzvah is more severe because you have to give up your life for it and one mitzvah is not. And we see that being expressed in the laws of ritual slaughter. So he says like this: apparently Sabbath violation is more severe in Jewish law than adultery. The Tanya now cites another point of law, which seems to prove the reverse is true. Nevertheless, the danger of life overrides the Sabbath laws, as noted above, but it does not override forbidden relations. He's just reiterating what I said before. The law states that if a person is threatened with his life to conduct an act of forbidden relations, he is to give up his life. This is just a Sabbath violation. It's less severe than forbidden relations. Since, as we have seen above, a person is not required to give up his life rather than transgress the Shabbos, what are we to conclude? There seems to be contradictory proofs as to the relative importance of Sabbath violations and forbidden relations. And here is his final argument. Rather, this supports our argument above that all the transgressions are equally severe, violation of God's will. And since the contradictory priorities required by Jewish law in different circumstances are clearly not a value judgment, but a matter of non-rational scriptural decree. So in case you didn't catch it, his point here is that we can never look at a outcome. We can never look at laws around a mitzvah or a sin and therefore make a judgment call about what's more important, what's less important. Because you will find, he's giving one example, but you can go on less examples. You will find as you delve into each mitzvah, you will find contradictory statements about each commandment. And that's because mitzvahs inherently are all equally bad in the fact that they disconnect you from God. And you can never truly put a value on one mitzvah over another. And that's why the statements about all different types of commandments are all over the place. And I think it's actually, in a sense, if you want to say it's by divine design, so that you should never belittle any mitzvah. There's no mitzvah that can be belittled. And the differences that you find between mitzvahs are rationalizations that we give ourselves. I like to say, I know some people that keep the Shabbat, don't keep the holidays. Okay, so you might say, what do you mean you don't drive on Shabbat, but you drive on Yom Tov, right? But I know some people, it's rationalization. They'll look at the verses, they'll look at what seems important, what one comes around every week. These are all rationalizations that we make in our mind. Again, I'm giving an example. We all create rationalizations at different areas of our life. And what it all boils down to is we're making judgment calls about mitzvahs. That's really what his point here is. The issue is, generally, we are making judgment calls about the commandments, just as that woman, the adulterous woman, made a judgment call that idolatry, no, that's really bad. I would never serve idolatry. But adultery, it's not too bad, right? You know why idolatry is bad? Because it has an I in it. Ego. No, I'm kidding. Okay. But adultery, my point is that it's funny. What we gathered from the Tanya is that we cannot make judgment calls about mitzvahs, but yet we do it all the time. All the time we make judgment calls about mitzvahs. And that is why, just as a side point, the Rabbi would not make judgment calls about mitzvahs. He would say, if you can get a person to do a mitzvah, you don't first look, what's the most important one? Then we'll go to the second most important, right? It's what mitzvah can we get the person to do now? Because in essence, every mitzvah is important. Some mitzvahs naturally will lead to doing other mitzvahs, and so you might want to pick those up. But in essence, if you're ready to do a mitzvah, don't say, well, I really should be doing something more. I really should be doing something less. Start with something. Stop making these judgment calls and defining what's more important. If the mitzvah inspires you, go ahead with it. Someone asked here, if no sin is worse than the others, how do we become perfect? Exactly. Well, that's the whole beginning of the Tanya. The Tanya says that perfection is really somebody who never sins. That's perfection. It also describes that an ultimate righteous person is someone who not only never sins, but has totally overcome their evil inclination. The intermediate person is the person who never sins, but they always desire to sin. And then there's the rest of us that we are wicked, that have some good. And we went in lengthy discussions in our earlier classes about how we shouldn't get depressed about that. But you are correct. None of us are perfect, and that's okay. You can join the club, join the rest of us. We're not perfect. We are all a work in progress, trying to become better every single day. Okay. So I was talking about the judgment calls that we make about mitzvahs. And it's very subtle. We do it, we make these judgments all the time, and sometimes we're not even realizing what we're doing. We're not even realizing that we're making those judgment calls. I'll just give an example of people talking in the synagogue. We make judgment calls. I see people that when they're saying Kaddish, they get very annoyed when other people talk, and then when someone else is saying Kaddish, they talk. Okay, no, all right, then that's off tangent. But no, really, there is a judgment call going on there. It's just how cognizant you are of it. the differentiation that we make between the good deeds that we do and the mitzvahs that we don't do is all based on our judgment calls about how important that mitzvah is or how not important that mitzvah is. That's why I always say when people tell me that they can't do something, right? They're too busy or they're too this. I always say it's really just a matter of priorities. It's typically not the circumstances that are dictating why people are doing certain mitzvahs and why others are not. It's generally most of the time a matter of priorities. When someone says, "Oh, I'm so busy, I can't come to pray, or I can't come to class, or I can't put on tefillin in the morning. I'm too busy." All the different things that go on in our lives are ultimately, we have to understand, a decision that we've made of what importance we placed on that deed. It's all a judgment call on our part. That's really all it is, and that's what defines whether we're ready to do it or not. And so my challenge for everybody this week, including myself, is first of all, catch yourself the next time you make a judgment call about something. But second of all, think of a mitzvah that you may have been lax in, that that you can change your view about it and respect it and observe it. And just to end off, the Torah says in Parshat Ekev, it's a Torah portion in the book of Deuteronomy, and it says over there, "V'haya Ekev Tishman." It shall be when you will listen to what the Lord your God tells you, then He will give you all types of blessings. And Rashi right over there explains that the word, and it shall be when you will listen, it uses a strange word. It uses the word Ekev, which also means heal. Again, Hebrew words have different meanings. And so Rashi there explains that the word heal is used specifically there. Why? He says because there are many people that trample mitzvos like we trample with our heel. There are certain things that we trample on. What do I mean we trample on them? That we get so used to doing them, it doesn't even register in our mind that we're doing something wrong. It doesn't even register in our mind that there's anything wrong. I'll give an example. For many people, gossip. They get so used to it, it almost doesn't feel like a sin. And when everybody else is doing it, it just feels normal. And so Rashi says there, these are the sins sha'adam dash ba'kavav, that a person is trampling with his feet. Or as the Talmudic sages say elsewhere, a person sins once, a person sins twice, a person sins 3 times, and by the time the person sins the 3rd time, the sins become like as if they're permitted. It almost feels like it's okay, it's fine. To give a more crude example of that, right? I've heard from people who, unfortunately, left the religious path, right? The first time they stopped keeping Shabbat, it felt weird. Or let's take the first time they ate non-kosher, it felt weird. The second time it felt weird, but eventually they lost their level of guilt. And so we have to also look at those things in our lives, those things that we may have been trampling upon, the deeds that we may have just dismissed because we've done it so many times, it's lost any value to us. That's really the problem. When we don't do something for such a long time, or when we do a sin so often, we forget about the value and the importance of what could be there. And so whether, let's talk about in the negative, give an example, maybe it's gossip. You need to clean up your gossip, or maybe it's talking in synagogue, or loving your fellow, loving your neighbor. In the political climate, it's very hard. And many people have trouble with that. There's all different areas. Or let's go on the positive. Maybe it's lighting the weekly Shabbat candles, or maybe it's Yom Tovs when they fall out on a weekday, or maybe it's Friday nights, or maybe it's praying in the morning, maybe it's washing your hands by your bedside. There are all different mitzvos, and we should remember that every mitzvah we do is I shouldn't say, well, how can I wash my hands in the morning if I'm not keeping Shabbat? How can I choose to stop eating cheeseburgers if I'm still eating shrimp? Don't make those judgment calls. Every sin you abstain from is allowing your soul to stay more connected with God. Every mitzvah that you do allows yourself to connect with God again. Don't prevent yourself from doing something good because you've made a judgment call. Don't allow those judgment calls to prevent you from taking upon yourself and doing something positive. So that's the message of this week. Stop making the judgment calls. Every mitzvah, it has something that we can take from it, and go out and do it.
That's your call.